Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Part of our continuing series on Medal of Honor winners, we'd like to honor Major Bernard F. Fisher, who died recently at the age of 87. Major Fisher was honored for his heroism during the Battle of the A Shau Valley in Vietnam in March of 1966 and was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Johnson in January of 1967. Before the end of his career, he was promoted to colonel, but we will refer to him by his rank in Vietnam here. Major Fisher was an Air Force pilot, and on March 10, 1966, he led a flight of Douglas A-1 East Sky Raiders World War II vintage propeller planes into the A Shau Valley. Another pilot, Major Dafford Jump Myers, had crash landed during the battle, and Major Fisher braved enemy fire, taxied down a 2,500-foot runway, and was able to pull his compatriot headfirst into his Sky Raider. After he returned to the airbase at Pleiku, it was discovered that 19 separate bullets had hit Major Fisher's plane during the mission. Before reading Major Fisher's citation, I want to talk a little bit about the A Shau Valley. When the war started, for all intents and purposes, in 1964, most of the enemy was Viet Cong, nationalized South Vietnamese communists. By 1965, the regular North Vietnamese army had entered the war. When we did our podcast on Basil Plumley, we talked about the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley, the first fixed battle between the North Vietnamese regulars and the United States in 1965. After the Battle of the Ia Drang, the North Vietnamese military leadership under the command of Van Nguyen Giap, whose podcast we've also done, decided to infiltrate South Vietnam with massive numbers of men and massive amounts of materiel. They planned on doing this through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through Laos, and thus, based on a decision by the American High Command and President Johnson, was impervious to attack from the air or through ground invasion by American troops. The A Shau Valley was in the central highlands of South Vietnam, and it was located right next to Laos, only a few kilometers away, and it represented a southern exit point for the Ho Chi Minh Trail from Laos into South Vietnam, and it was critical that the North Vietnamese gain control of that territory as a forward point for their infiltration. In the spring of 1966, the land was under the control of American Special Forces, but in March of 1966, the North Vietnamese attacked with a massive invasion, huge manpower advantage over the Americans, and they overran the base. The Americans, lacking the manpower to match the North Vietnamese in the battle, counterattacked through the air where they had massive superiority. But since the A Shau was a valley, it was often covered by clouds. The cloud cover did not permit many of the American planes to strafe, and the mountains on either side of the valley provided great cover for the North Vietnamese to attack the American planes, which is what happened to Major Fisher. His Medal of Honor citation reads as follows. On 10 March 1966, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. On that date, the Special Forces camp at A Shau was under attack by 2,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars. Hostile troops had positioned themselves between the airstrip and the camp. Other hostile troops had surrounded the camp and were continuously raking it with automatic weapons fired from the surrounding hills. The top of the 1,500-foot hills were obscured by an 800-foot ceiling, limiting aircraft maneuverability and forcing pilots to operate within range of hostile gun positions, which often were able to fire down on the attacking aircraft. During the battle, Major Fisher observed a fellow airman crash land on the battle-torn airstrip. In the belief that the downed pilot was seriously injured and in imminent danger of capture, Major Fisher announced his intention to land on the airstrip to effect a rescue. Although aware of the extreme danger and likely failure of such an attempt, he elected to continue. Directing his own air cover, he landed his aircraft and taxied almost the full length of the runway, which was littered with battle debris and parts of an exploded aircraft. While effecting a successful rescue of the downed pilot, heavy ground fire was observed, with 19 bullets striking his aircraft. In the face of withering ground fire, he applied power and gained enough speed to lift off at the overrun of the airstrip. Major Fisher's profound concern for his fellow airman, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, are in the highest traditions of the U.S. Air Force and reflect great credit upon him and the armed forces of his country. Here is the medalofhonor.org website with their interview of Major Fisher several years ago as he describes what happened that day.
My folks were farmers, and in the wintertime they had some time off, so they could get out and work in California. And my folks went down, my mother went down there, and I was born there in San Bernardino. And I lived there about 2 weeks and then came home, so I was born in California, but I grew up in Clearfield, Utah. I built model airplanes when I grew up, and I liked to fly them. We had a church group, a fellow that had just checked out in a J3 Cub. He one day asked us if we'd like to go for a ride in his airplane. And of course, I was willing to go any place for an airplane ride. And so we ended up in the J3 Cub. And I thought that was just the greatest thing.
Bernard Fisher began his military career in the Navy near the end of World War II. He served in the Idaho Air National Guard after college, before eventually enlisting and earning his wings in the U.S. Air Force. In 1965, Fisher and 4 other pilots from his squadron volunteered to serve in Vietnam. On March 10, 1966, Fisher and his wingman were flying their World War II vintage A-1E8 Sky Raiders in the vicinity of the A Shau Valley near Laos. A U.S. Special Forces camp had been overrun by a superior North Vietnamese force and required assistance. But the narrow approach was dotted with lethal anti-aircraft emplacements and was enshrouded in dense cloud cover.
We got diverted from a mission to Kontum into the A Shau area. And so we took our airplanes up on top and went in and clear sky so we could see the North Vietnamese had moved in on the camp. They made it through the night, but but when we arrived in the area, they told us to divert to the strike aircraft and to get in and help them if we could. And so we began probing the areas, trying to find a place to get down. You can see a mountain with snow on it over here, but you can see the bottom of the clouds. And then I spotted a break in the clouds, and I knew where we was at. So I called and said, I know where we're at. And so this flight turned and came back with the 2 of us. And we went in, the 4 of us just lined up in trail, went down through the hole, down on the deck and into the A Shau area. We switched over to the FM radio, which is a radio that you can directly talk to the person on the ground. And he said, there's 3 mortar bunkers there that belong to the Vietnamese and to the Americans. He said you could hit anything in the camp except that mortar bunker. It had our friendlies in it. So I made a left turn and came down the final approach and right over the camp and had 4 cannons on my line, and I just hosed them down and cleaned the line off. And the idea is to straighten them out and make them get up and get out of there, or they're going to get hit. So Papa, my wingman, he slid over and he strafed the ground. And then Jump Myers, this other guy that was leading the flight, leading his flight, he slid over to strafe him. He strafed on the way in, and as he pulled off, they hit him. And he caught on fire. And he was burning pretty badly. So he hit the steel matting, which is the runway, skidded about 800 feet, went off the right side, hit the bank. I watched for a moment. I called the command post, the big airplane. Said we had a pilot down, and he was probably killed in the crash because he was really burning. He was just in a ball of fire. And about that time, the fire kind of blew away from the right side of the airplane. He came out across the wing and dove into the ditch, and hit the ground, went on his knees. And I seen him run, and I went right after him, went right over his head, pulled up, and went right in front of him. He waved back. I called him, told him we needed some help. We needed a helicopter.
After being assured that a rescue helicopter was on its way, Fisher rejoined the fight. But 10 minutes later, with the situation on the ground growing steadily worse, there was still no sign of the promised chopper.
That's about the time that I realized that we had to get him out of there some way because he wouldn't make it otherwise. I knew the runway was short. I could tell it would look pretty bad for the airplane. I called the command post, and that's when they said the runway is 3,500 feet long. And that made me feel good because I can land at 3,000 feet. But it was a mistake. The runway is only 2,500 feet long, and it's too short for the runway. But we made the decision, and I got some comments about not going in, but I felt it was necessary to do that. I came through the smoke and the fire and the camp and touched her down about 95 knots. And boom, hit the ground and skidded. I was off on the runway and on the runway until I got to the end of the runway and then realized that I couldn't stop it. I just ran out of runway and ran out of brakes. And they were red hot. I was really cooking them. I damaged the right wing and the right tail section. I got it turned around and got it taxied back on the runway. And I taxied down the runway about 800 feet. And when I did, he jumped up and waved his hands, and I spotted him, and I hit the brakes. and he made a run for the airplane. But I became aware about that time that they were hitting me, and I was taking quite a few rounds. And so I watched for just a moment, and he didn't make it, and I felt perhaps he probably got hit trying to get to the airplane and was probably down someplace. So I locked the brakes and crawled out of the airplane. In order to get him, I felt real strong about it. And I just felt that we had to do it. And I called the command post and told him I was doing it. I didn't ask him, I just told him I was doing it. And it worked. We crawled up the side of the wing, put his head and arms in the cockpit, and I just jumped up and straddled him, put one leg on each side of the cockpit and pulled him in head first right into the cockpit. We didn't even strap in. I slid down in the seat and spun her around and gave it all the throttle she had. I thought we were in pretty serious trouble, but the airplane came off the ground. I don't think we would have got him back if we didn't. They weren't taking any prisoners. But he survived. His name was Dafford Myers. He just got promoted to lieutenant colonel that morning. And he said he didn't think he'd ever pin those eagles on his shoulder. I didn't know much about the medal at the time, and I still probably don't know as much as I should. But it's a great feeling to know that you're recognized for what you've done, and it represents a lot of other people. A lot of people were involved in that battle that day. Well, I think that the Americans are compassionate and will do most anything reasonable to help somebody who's in trouble. Any one of those guys could have had an excuse for not going in there, but it's important that you respond to your feelings, I think, when the time comes for it.
North Vietnamese seized control of the A Shau Valley, and it became one of the key areas of the war. In 1966, it was still believed that the United States was winning the war, so we heard very little about the defeat at A Shau. But once the North Vietnamese had secured the area, they fortified it, especially with sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses. This is where they learned many of their anti-aircraft techniques. Because Laos was off limits to American forces, the A Shau Valley became a major supply point for the North Vietnamese Army, especially for the Tet Offensive in 1968. It's frankly amazing today that the American public wasn't more aware of the North Vietnamese control of that area of South Vietnam. The importance of the A Shau Valley was highlighted the next year. In what was likely the last chance for American military victory, in May of 1969, Operation Apache Snow was launched to retake the valley, and the fighting took place largely at Ap Bia Mountain overlooking the valley, Hill 937, which became known as Hamburger Hill. Both the United States and the North Vietnamese armies took tremendous casualties. The United States had perhaps a 30% casualty rate, and the North Vietnamese may have had as high as a 50% casualty rate, losing over 600 men, and therein lies the name Hamburger Hill. But the United States was able to retake the mountain and gain control of the valley, as most of the surviving North Vietnamese army slipped back into Laos. However, even though the Americans took back the territory, the death rate was so high that it caused a cause célèbre in Congress. It reinforced the anti-war movement, and heavily covered by the press. The necessity of fighting on Hill 937 was questioned by the public. The whole controversy was aggravated when the military made the decision not to hold the hill and abandon it a month later. At that point, in the middle of 1969, it became unlikely the United States could secure a military victory in South Vietnam. As a result of the public and political pressure, General Creighton Abrams altered United States strategy in Vietnam from one of maximum pressure to protective reaction in an effort to lower casualties, and ultimately the North Vietnamese, with reinforcements, entered through Laos and took back the A Shau Valley. So in many ways it was emblematic of the whole American strategy and involvement in Vietnam. None of this, however, should diminish our admiration of Major Fisher, his bravery, and his phenomenal flying ability. I want to close on that note and thank my producer, Sid Tepps. Major Fisher, our gratitude is unlimited. We cannot thank you enough for the sacrifices you made for our country. To honor you, we will close with the Air Force Funeral Taps.